Maynooth is the focus of this question, but it could equally apply to a number of different locations, both in North Kildare or other parts of the country. It's under the same pressure and has the same profile of rents as Leixlip and Selbridge, for example, and both of them are included. And the fallout from it has almost been immediate, and it's as though landlords are taking it as almost a requirement that they should get their rents up to the average that are going in the area if they're below that, and there's certainly people under pressure to move out of their houses now.
My immediate response to that is it would be a very foolish landlord if they start to put up rents significantly in a town like Maynooth, because it's the one guarantee, if they do that, that they will come under the rent pressure zone designations. So I think it would be very counterproductive if their concern is the ability to increase rent. On the 24th of January 2017, in accordance with Section 24A of the Residential Tenancies Act 2004, the Housing Agency proposed that 15 local electoral areas should be considered for designation as rent pressure zones. On foot of the proposal from the Housing Agency, and again in accordance with the Act, I requested the Director of the RTB to make a report to me as to whether these areas met the criteria for designation as rent pressure zones. On the 26th of January 2017, I received a report from the RTB confirming that 12 out of the 15 local electoral areas examined met the criteria, and I made orders designating those 12 areas as rent pressure zones on the 26th of January. The areas designated included the local electoral areas of Naas, Selbridge, Leixlip and Kildare Newbridge. For an area, as you know, Deputy, to be designated as a rent pressure zone, it must satisfy the criteria set out in Section 24A4 of the Residential Tenancies Act 2004 as amended. 1. The annual rate of rent inflation in the area must have been 7% or more in 4 of the last 6 quarters, and the average rent in the area in the last quarter must be above the average national rent in the last quarter. In terms of the local electoral area of Maynooth, the report received from the RTB indicated that while the average rent in the area was above the average national rent for the quarter, the annual rate of rent inflation in the area was greater than 7% in only 3 of the last 6 quarters. The requirement for designation is for the annual rate of rent inflation in the area to be 7% for more than 4 of the last 6 quarters. Therefore, Maynooth didn't qualify under the criteria as set out, but may well do if rents continue to increase in the future. So we will keep these areas under consideration. Deputy, of all deputies in this House, I think you will appreciate more than most that we have to make decisions when you're intervening in the property market on the basis of independent analysis and data and not politics. And that is why, and there was an argument on that before Christmas. Have an opportunity to come back. So I will rely on the independent data that is gathered by the RTB, and we'll make decisions accordingly.
Thank you, Deputy Murphy.
The reality of it is that, and you can ask your own deputy from North Kildare the experience that he's having with people coming from Maynooth, because it won't be all just coming to me. And it's having the effect that I would have predicted it's having, by virtue of the fact that it's specific areas that are selected. It's a flawed process, and in fact we made the argument that it should be linked to the CPI. But can I just say, Minister, that the Residential Tenancies Act under Section 139, landlords are supposed to notify if there's a rent increase. There's no evidence that is done universally. In fact, I think I got a reply from you or from the RTB that we're not updated. The other thing is that this is a university town, for example. Let's just use Maynooth. It's a university town, so there's particular cycles that you will have a very large cohort of renters. The electoral area itself, in this particular case, and I'm sure it's other areas as well, the electoral area is actually quite a large electoral area with a big rural hinterland, and it actually impacts on the profile of Maynooth as a town. There's pressure from people who are working in multinationals, but the immediate reaction, Minister, is. The immediate reaction is, and I can pass you on details, and will pass you on details, the immediate reaction is to give people notice, to say that there's going to be an increase, up to the market rents in the area that are higher than people are paying at the moment, and significantly higher in some cases.
You have an opportunity to come back in, Minister. 1 minute.
The first point I'd make is that whether or not the limitations on rent increases in rent pressure zones was linked to CPI or was 4% wouldn't have made any difference here. This is about a qualification criteria to be designated. And we moved away from the process of assessing on the basis of a local authority area, because it was far too broad, and therefore rural areas would bring down averages, which would have an unfair impact on towns and so on. Which is why we looked at a much more granular, more targeted way and more localised way of assessing rents in certain areas. And we looked at local electoral areas, which is really the only way that we could have done it. You know, there are people, undoubtedly, in Navan, in Maynooth, in Greystones, in Drogheda, who feel that they should be rent pressure zones. And they would like to be. And it's popular, certainly, for tenants in areas to know that their landlords can't increase rent above 4% annually. But I have to make decisions on the basis of the data and the criteria that we set out in the legislation. There's a reason why we picked that criteria. We need to know that there's a sustained, unaffordable level of rental inflation for a period of time, and that the actual rents are also very high versus the national average. And if there is a sustained problem in Maynooth, then it's likely to qualify at some stage in the not-too-distant future.
Supplementary.
The problem is that the areas will qualify by virtue of the fact that there's that people are maybe forced out by way of ceasing a tenancy, increasing rents, and so on. And there's plenty of evidence of that, immediate evidence of that, Minister. We did make the argument that it should be nationally applied, and it shouldn't be based on zones. We obviously have points of disagreement on the approach you're taking, but I'm just talking about how it's actually playing out. And this is one area I'm very familiar with, how it's playing out. The problem is that people have to be put under pressure, and it actually has very negative effects on people for them to qualify in a situation where they're missing out in places like Maynooth, as you say, Navan, Greystones, and other areas. And I will send you, Minister, evidence of the kind of pressure that we're seeing. And I just don't think the places like Maynooth are the same, because it's a university town. It's the only town with a university in it. And I think that the one-size-fits-all doesn't apply in that particular case.
No, Mr. One. Can
I say that, if we'd applied these restrictions nationally across the board, we would have had the extraordinary effect, I think, in some parts of the country where there is no viability to provide rental accommodation because property values fell and rental values also fell very significantly. And we would essentially be putting a ceiling on those very, very low values and not allowing investment in many towns across the country. I think that would have been massively counterproductive. And so instead, we wanted to target the areas where we knew there was a significant problem, where demand was such that it was driving rents up at a crazy and unaffordable level. And that is why we picked the rent pressure zone model, which is, and they've done something very similar in Scotland because they had a similar profile to what we had. But I mean, if there are incidents happening, don't forget there are pretty strong protections for tenants outside of rent pressure zone regulations or restrictions that the RTB are there to enforce and monitor. A landlord can't simply evict somebody. There has to be legal grounds for that. Okay. There are extended notice periods now for that. Security of tenure is stronger after the legislation that we introduced. It's now 6 years rather than 4 years. So, if people and landlords are abusing that, we need to hear about it, and the RTB needs to hear about it. And just for the record, the number of complaints that have come into the RTB since the rent pressure zones were introduced has significantly increased because both landlords and tenants, I think, have a better understanding because of the profile of that debate as to their own rights. And I think that's a good thing.
Okay. Now,